There is a room at Harewood House in West Yorkshire that contains 18 gilded armchairs. They were made by Thomas Chippendale, the most famous furniture maker in English history, who was born just 7 miles from where they now stand. Each chair was invoiced on the 12th of November 1773 as cabriole armchairs, very richly carved in the antique manner and gilt in burnished gold, stuffed and covered with your damask. They are exquisite. They are among the finest pieces of 18th century craftsmanship in Europe, and they were paid for with money earned by enslaving human beings on sugar plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada, and Tobago. Every gilded arm, every carved flourish, but every inch of burnished gold in those 18 chairs represents a transaction in which human life was converted into decorative art. The man who commissioned them, Edwin was one of the wealthiest men in England. He owned or managed 24 plantations across 4 Caribbean islands. He controlled nearly 30,000 acres of land worked by enslaved Africans whose life expectancy was between 20 and 22 years. More than half the babies born into slavery on his plantations died before the age of 5. Edwin took the profits from this system, converted them into land, stone, plaster, gilding, silk, mahogany, and paint, and built one of the most beautiful houses in England. And he filled it with the most beautiful furniture money could buy. And today, 500,000 people a year walk through the rooms and admire the craftsmanship and read the interpretation panels that Harewood House has, to its considerable credit, placed alongside the Chippendales and the Reynolds portraits and the Robert Adams ceilings to tell visitors what the beauty cost and who paid for it. This is the story of that house, and if these deep investigations into the families and empires behind Britain's greatest landmarks are worth your time, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me which property we should investigate next. Unlike some of the properties in this series, Harewood does not hide from its history. It puts it on the wall. The question is whether putting it on the wall is enough. The Lascelles family had been landowners in Yorkshire since the late 13th century, a farming gentry with modest estates and no particular distinction. Their transformation from minor Yorkshire landholders into one of the wealthiest families in England began in the early 1700s, when 3 brothers, George, Henry, and Edward, sailed to Barbados. The island had been colonized by the English since the 1620s and had become one of the most profitable territories in the British Empire. Its economy built entirely on sugar and on the enslaved Africans who were forced to produce it. George arrived first, before 1706. Henry followed in 1711 or 1712. Edward came in 1715. Their initial activities were as sugar merchants, buying raw sugar from plantation owners and exporting it to London. But Henry Lascelles was not content to be a middleman. He wanted to control the entire supply chain, from the African coast to the English consumer, and over the next 2 decades, he assembled the machinery to do it. Barbados, in the early 18th century, was not a frontier outpost. It was a machine. The island, barely 166 square miles in total, had been divided into plantations so thoroughly that almost no land remained uncultivated. The primary crop was sugarcane, a plant that required enormous labor to grow, harvest, and process, and the labor was provided by enslaved Africans who had been transported across the Atlantic in conditions of unspeakable cruelty. The sugar, produced on Barbados and the other Caribbean islands, was one of the most valuable commodities in the world, more profitable per acre than any crop grown in England. The men who controlled its production and export were among the richest in the British Empire. By the early 1700s, Barbados had been producing sugar for nearly a century, and the human cost of that production was staggering. The enslaved population of the island outnumbered the free population by a ratio of roughly 4 to 1. The mortality rate among enslaved workers was so high that the plantation system required a constant supply of new captives from Africa to replace those who died. This was the market that the Lascelles entered. Henry Lascelles intended to be one of its masters, and he succeeded by being not merely a planter, but a financier, a trader, a customs official, and ultimately a slave trader, assembling a portfolio of interests that touched every stage of the process from capture to consumption. The foundation stone of the Lascelles' fortune was laid in 1714 or 1715, when Henry became collector of customs for the port of Bridgetown, Barbados. The post was lucrative in itself, but it also provided something even more valuable: information. Henry knew which plantation owners were struggling, which were overextended, which were vulnerable to foreclosure. He used this knowledge to build a lending business, advancing money to planters at rates they could not sustain and waiting for them to default. When they did, he took their plantations, their land, their equipment, and their enslaved workers. Every foreclosure added more acreage, more sugar production, and more human beings to the Lascelles' portfolio. It was a system designed to grow through the failure of others, a mechanism of accumulation that fed on the debt and desperation of other men, and on the bodies of enslaved people who had no say in any of it. It was financial predation dressed in the language of commerce, and it worked spectacularly. Allegations of corruption were inevitable. The customs collector in Bridgetown had enormous discretionary power over which ships were inspected, which cargoes were assessed for duty, and which merchants were favoured with access to the port's facilities. Henry exploited every advantage the position offered. He used official information for private gain. He assessed favourable duty rates for business partners. He turned a public office into a private profit centre. When he was finally suspended, it was not because the authorities disapproved of his methods, but because rival merchants complained loudly enough to force an investigation. The suspension was temporary. The fortune was permanent. His brother Edwin succeeded him as collector, maintaining the family's access to the intelligence that made their lending business so profitable. Henry married Mary Carter, the daughter of a Barbadian slave trader, binding the Lascelles to the trafficking of human beings through marriage as well as commerce. His first documented involvement in the physical trade in enslaved people came in 1713, when he and two partners shipped 100 enslaved Africans from Barbados on a vessel called the Caraco Merchant. He also bought shares in more than 20 slaving ships that carried kidnapped Africans across the Atlantic under conditions that are difficult to describe and impossible to justify. The most disturbing detail in the Lascelles archive is the floating slave factory. Henry maintained a ship moored permanently off the coast of Guinea in West Africa. This vessel served as a holding facility where newly enslaved people, captured from their homes in the African interior and marched to the coast, were imprisoned until they could be collected by other vessels and transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. It was a warehouse for human beings, anchored in the ocean, operated at the edge of the known world where no law applied and no oversight existed. The people held on the ship had been torn from their families, their communities, and their languages. They had been captured through a combination of warfare, kidnapping, and sale by African traders who participated in a system that Europeans had created and sustained through demand. The conditions on the slave ships that carried them across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, are well documented and almost beyond comprehension. Enslaved people were packed into holds so tightly that they could not stand or turn over. Disease spread rapidly in the darkness. Dysentery, smallpox, and fevers killed thousands during the crossing. Those who died were thrown overboard. Those who survived arrived in the Caribbean broken, terrified, and already marked by the violence of the system that claimed them. And the floating factory off Guinea was merely the first station in this process, and the point of collection before the ocean crossing began. They were held in darkness, in chains, in conditions of filth and terror that the contemporary records describe only in the driest commercial terms. They were cargo, They were inventory. They were the raw material from which the Lascelles fortune was manufactured. By the time Henry returned to London to establish his sugar distribution business, he had assembled an operation that controlled every stage of the process: the capture and holding of enslaved people in Africa, their transportation across the Atlantic, their sale to plantation owners in the Caribbean, the production of sugar on plantations he increasingly owned himself, and the export and distribution of that sugar in England. He was, in the language of modern business, vertically integrated. He was also one of the wealthiest men in the country. He acquired a seat in Parliament. He moved in the higher circles of Georgian London, and in 1738 he purchased the combined estates of Harewood and Gawthorpe in West Yorkshire. The money for the purchase came from sugar. The sugar came from enslaved people. The enslaved people came from ships. And the land in Yorkshire, ancient and green and beautiful, absorbed the money without asking where it had been. Henry Lascelles did not live to see the house that his fortune would build. In 1753, he died by suicide. The circumstances are not recorded in detail, and the family has never elaborated publicly on the cause. What is known is that despite Harewood House being filled with portraits, paintings of Lascelles, men and women across 3 centuries, there is no image of Henry. The man who created the fortune is invisible. The money he made is everywhere, in every room, in every ceiling, in every gilded chair. But his face is absent. It is one of the most unsettling details in the entire Harewood story, and it has never been adequately explained. His son Edwin inherited the estate and the fortune, and Edwin had a vision that Henry, for all his commercial genius, could never have imagined. The scale of Henry's fortune at the time of his death was almost unprecedented for a man without a title. He had accumulated wealth through sugar trading, customs collecting, money lending, slave trading, and the sugar distribution business he established in London after returning from Barbados. His warehouses held raw sugar imported from the Caribbean. His ships carried goods back and forth across the Atlantic. His agents collected debts from plantation owners across 4 islands. The business operated through a London commission house called Lascelles and Maxwell, which handled the commercial side of the family's operations, and whose records now form the core of the Borthwick Archive at the University of York. When Henry died, the estate he left was worth enough to purchase one of the largest landholdings in Yorkshire and commission the construction of a country house that would take 12 years to complete and would be furnished by the most expensive craftsmen in England. All of this, every stone and every stick of furniture, traces back to Barbados, to the customs house in Bridgetown, to the ships on the Atlantic, to the floating factory off the coast of Guinea, to the bodies of people whose names survive only in property inventories and whose descendants still carry the surname of the family that owned them. When Edwin inherited the combined estates of Harewood and Gawthorpe in the 1750s, the landscape was ancient. Harewood Castle, a medieval ruin on the edge of the estate, had been built in the 14th century and had served as a stronghold during the Wars of the Roses before falling into decay. Gawthorpe Hall, the manor house that stood on the site where Harewood House now stands, was a modest building by aristocratic standards. All Saints Church, the estate's parish church, had Norman origins and contained medieval tombs of the Gascoigne family, who had owned the land before the Lascelles arrived. Edwin looked at all of this, looked at the ancient castle and the modest manor, and the church with its Norman arches, and he decided that none of it was good enough. He would demolish Gawthorpe Hall and replace it with something that reflected not the history of the place, but the scale of the fortune that had bought it. The foundation stone was laid in 1759. The old hall was pulled down, and on the site, where Yorkshire farming families had lived for centuries, a palace began to rise, paid for by Caribbean sugar and built by Yorkshire stone. Edwin Lascelles wanted to build the finest house in England, and he had the money to try. In 1759, the same year that Arthur Guinness signed his 9,000-year lease in Dublin, and the 13 monks founded Fountains Abbey 4 centuries earlier, Edwin laid the foundation stone of Harewood House. he assembled what can only be described as a dream team of 18th century English design. John Carr of York, one of the most accomplished architects practicing in the north of England, was commissioned to design the house in the Palladian style, inspired by the classical architecture of ancient Rome. Robert Adam, the Scottish architect who was then the most fashionable interior designer in the country, was brought in to design the interiors. Thomas Chippendale, England's greatest furniture maker, was commissioned to furnish every room from top to bottom, the largest and most lucrative commission of his career, worth over £10,000, equivalent to more than £1 million today. And Lancelot Capability Brown, the landscape designer who had already transformed the grounds of Chatsworth and Blenheim and dozens of other great houses, but was engaged to reshape the surrounding 1,000 acres of Yorkshire countryside into the idealised English parkland that visitors see today. Brown arrived in the 1770s and applied his signature method. Formal gardens were ripped out, replaced by sweeping lawns that rolled down to a serpentine lake. Trees were planted in carefully calculated clumps designed to look natural but positioned with mathematical precision to frame specific views. A village that stood too close to the house was relocated. Its inhabitants moved to make way for the aesthetic vision of a man who had never lived in a village and who saw people as impediments to landscape. The village relocation was not unique to Harewood. Dozens of English country houses demolished or moved entire communities to create the illusion of pastoral isolation. At Chatsworth, Edwin I Duke removed the village of Edensor from his sightline. At Blenheim, the landscape swallowed farmsteads and cottages without ceremony. At Harewood, the displaced villagers were rehoused elsewhere on the estate, but the principle was the same. The people who lived on the land were less important than the aesthetic vision of the people who owned it. The result was stunning. The park at Harewood is one of Brown's finest achievements, 1,000 acres of green that look as though they have existed since the beginning of time. They have not. They were manufactured at enormous cost by labourers who are not named in the records, just as the enslaved people who funded the project are not named in the ledgers. 4 geniuses working simultaneously on a single building. It was an unprecedented concentration of talent. It was also, in every particular, funded by the labour of enslaved Africans who would never see the house, never walk through its rooms, and never know that the sugar they harvested under the Caribbean sun had been converted into gilded armchairs and painted ceilings and Axminster carpets on the other side of the world. The irony of Harewood's construction is that it was built by free Yorkshire labourers who were themselves among the poorest people in England. The stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, and general labourers who erected the walls and carved the cornices were paid, but they were paid poorly, and their working conditions were harsh by any standard. Building an 18th century country house was dangerous work. Stone was quarried locally and hauled by horse and cart. Scaffolding was rudimentary. Falls were common. The men who built Harewood House lived in temporary shelters on the estate during the construction period, separated from their families, working in all weathers and returning home at the end of the project with wages that would not have sustained a family for more than a few months. Their names, like the names of the enslaved people whose labour funded the project, do not appear in the histories of the house. What appears are the names of the architects: John Carr, Robert Adam, Thomas Chippendale, Capability Brown. The genius is remembered. The hands that realise the genius are forgotten. This is the invisible labour through line that connects Harewood to every other property in this series. The people who build are never the people who are credited with building. The house that emerged from this 12-year construction programme was a masterpiece of Georgian restraint on the outside and neoclassical extravagance on the inside. John Carr's exterior is a study in Palladian proportions, a central block flanked by wings, built in local sandstone that glows golden in the Yorkshire light, with a south-facing facade that looks out across Brown's parkland to the lake and the hills beyond. Adam redesigned elements of Carr's original plans, adding internal courtyards and refining details that a visitor might never consciously notice, but that contribute to the building's sense of harmony and balance. The house was designed to impress on approach. The drive winds through Brown's parkland, past carefully positioned clumps of trees, before the full facade is revealed in a single, calculated moment. It is a trick of presentation that Brown and Carr and Adam understood instinctively, the same trick that Capability Brown had used at Chatsworth and that John Aislabie had used to frame the ruins of Fountains Abbey. The building appears at exactly the moment when the visitor's anticipation has reached its peak, and the effect, even today, is breathtaking. The house seems to belong to the landscape, as if it grew there rather than being placed. It did not grow, it was imposed, and the money that imposed it was harvested from the bodies of enslaved Africans 4,000 miles away. The house took 12 years to build, from 1759 to 1771. Chippendale's commission alone took 30 years to complete, from 1767 to 1797, now spanning both Chippendale's lifetime and that of his son Thomas Jr., who finished the work after his father's death in 1779. The results were extraordinary. The entrance hall was designed by Adam to resemble the interior of a Greco-Roman temple, with 12 painted half columns lining the walls. The music room, the most complete Robert Adam interior in the house, survives with its original ceilings, walls, furnishings, and an Axminster carpet that was designed specifically for the room and whose circular pattern creates a sense of movement and melody. The yellow drawing room, the first in a suite of entertaining rooms on the west side, is named after the colour of the damask on its walls, a colour chosen by Edwin Lascelles himself, a man who could specify the shade of silk on his walls while enslaved people on his plantations slept on bare earth. The cinnamon drawing room takes its name from the warm tone of its wall coverings and contains a pair of Chippendale japanned cabinets mounted on neoclassical stands that are among the finest examples of chinoiserie furniture in England. The Chinese wallpaper in the east bedroom depicts idealized scenes of industry in China, the production of rice, tea, silk, and porcelain, a reminder that the 18th century's appetite for luxury was not limited to sugar, and that the exploitation of labor for the production of beauty was a global phenomenon. The gallery, the largest room in the house, stretches 76 feet in length, its ceiling painted by Biagio Rebecca, its walls hung with Reynolds family portraits, or its floor originally covered with a carpet that mirrored the ceiling design above, a hallmark of Adam interiors. Chippendale's masterpieces are throughout: satinwood and marquetry commodes inlaid with rosewood, japanned cabinets mounted on neoclassical stands, looking glasses so elaborately carved that Victorian owners later stripped them of their ornamentation, not realizing their value, and had to have them painstakingly restored in the 1990s. The state bed, designed for the state bedroom where royal guests would sleep, was the most expensive single piece of furniture Thomas Chippendale ever made. It was a parade bed, a piece of display furniture intended not for comfort but for spectacle, announcing to visiting dignitaries that the owner of this house could afford to commission the finest craftsmen in England to build a bed that no one would sleep in. Chippendale's invoices for Harewood survive in extraordinary detail, listing every item with its price, materials, and a brief description that reads like a catalogue of 18th century luxury. 18 cabriole armchairs, looking glasses with elaborately carved frames, commodes inlaid with rosewood and satinwood in patterns that required hundreds of hours of skilled labour from Chippendale's workshop on St Martin's Lane in London. The total commission exceeded £10,000, making it worth more than £1 million in today's money. It exists today in the same room for which it was designed, in the same house that slavery built. Or the Chippendale connection is worth pausing on, because it complicates the story in a way that simple narratives of exploitation and guilt cannot accommodate. Thomas Chippendale was not an aristocrat. He was the son of a joiner from Otley, a small market town 7 miles from Harewood. He he received a basic education at the local grammar school, learned woodworking from his father, and moved to London as a young man to establish himself in the furniture trade. His rise was extraordinary. His Director, published in 1754, was the most important collection of furniture designs ever published in England and made his name synonymous with quality craftsmanship. He was elected to the Royal Society of Arts. His furniture was owned by Catherine the Great and Louis XVI. He was, by any measure, a genius. And the commission at Harewood, his largest and most ambitious, was the work on which his reputation most securely rests. The satinwood commodes and the gilded armchairs and the carved curtain swags that trick the eye into believing they are fabric are masterpieces of the cabinet maker's art. They are also products of a system. Chippendale did not enslave anyone. He made furniture. But the money that paid for that furniture came from people who did enslave others. And the beauty that Chippendale created at Harewood is inseparable from the suffering that funded it. This is the dilemma that Harewood forces on every visitor. You cannot admire the Chippendale without acknowledging the Lascelles. You cannot separate the art from the money, and the money came from ships. Chippendale himself died in 1779 at the age of 61 of tuberculosis. He was buried at St. Martin in the Fields in London, in the cemetery that has since been built upon by the National Gallery. He died without significant wealth. His business was profitable, but never made him rich in the way his clients were rich. The man whose name became synonymous with English craftsmanship, whose director was owned by Catherine the Great and Louis XVI, whose furniture is now worth millions at auction, died in relative obscurity and was buried in an unmarked grave. The irony is bitter. The craftsman who created the most beautiful objects in Harewood House was closer in material circumstances to the labourers who built the walls than to the Lascelles who paid the bills. He was, in his own way, another kind of invisible worker, a man whose genius served the wealth of others and whose reward was a pauper's burial in a London churchyard. While Edwin was building his palace in Yorkshire, the plantations in the Caribbean were expanding. The Borthwick Institute at the University of York holds 7 boxes of Lascelles family archives dating from 1677 to the 19th century, documenting in commercial detail the ownership and management of enslaved people across Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada, and Tobago. The records are meticulous. They list names, ages, occupations, prices. They track births, deaths, purchases, and sales with the same dispassionate precision that a modern corporation might use to manage inventory. The language is a language of property. Enslaved people are described as stock, as hands, as property. Their humanity is absent from the ledgers. What is present is the arithmetic. So many workers, so many acres, so many hogsheads of sugar, so many pounds of profit. By the late 1780s, Edwin Lascelles controlled nearly 30,000 acres across 4 Caribbean islands. He owned or managed 24 plantations. The financial crisis, triggered by the American Revolution, which collapsed credit markets across the Caribbean between 1772 and 1783, had actually benefited the Lascelles. Plantation owners who had borrowed from the family could not repay their debts, and the Lascelles foreclosed, acquiring the plantations and every enslaved person on them. Edwin did not inherit these people. He seized them through the machinery of debt collection. He became one of the largest landowners in the Caribbean, not through pioneering spirit or agricultural innovation, but through the same financial predation that his father Henry had perfected decades earlier in Bridgetown. The Borthwick archive includes plantation inventories that assign monetary values to individual human beings based on their age, health, and skill. Skilled workers, carpenters, coopers, boilermen were valued more highly than field hands. Children were valued at a fraction of adult prices. Elderly or infirm enslaved people were listed at reduced rates, their declining bodies reducing their worth in the same way that a worn piece of machinery might be depreciated in a modern accounting system. The dehumanization was not incidental to the record keeping, it was the purpose of it. The Lascelles managed their enslaved workforce with the same commercial logic that they applied to their sugar inventories, because in the legal and economic framework of the British Caribbean, enslaved people were property, and property must be counted, valued, insured, and when necessary, disposed of. The conditions on the Lascelles plantations were consistent with the broader horrors of Caribbean slavery. Enslaved workers laboured in tropical heat from before dawn until after dark during the harvest season, cutting sugarcane with machetes, feeding it into crushing mills, and boiling the juice in enormous copper vats over open fires. Burns were common. Injuries from the crushing mills were common. Exhaustion was universal. The diet was inadequate. Housing was squalid. Medical care was non-existent. High punishments for resistance included whipping, branding, mutilation, and death. Life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Barbadian sugar plantation was between 20 and 22 years. More than half of all babies born into slavery died before the age of 5. 10% died before the age of 10. These are not abstractions. These are the conditions under which the money was made that paid for Robert Adams' painted ceilings and Thomas Chippendale's gilded armchairs and Capability Brown's serpentine lake. The sugar harvest season, known as crop time, was the most brutal period of the year. It lasted from January to June, and during these months, enslaved workers could be forced to labour for 18 hours a day. The cane had to be cut, transported to the mill, crushed, and the juice boiled within hours of harvesting to prevent spoilage. The boiling houses were hellish environments, with temperatures that could exceed 140 degrees and open fires heating copper vats of liquid sugar that splashed and burned anyone who stood too close. The British physician James Granger, who visited Caribbean plantations in the 18th century, described the conditions as combining every kind of misery. And the Lascelles, like all planters, relied on violence to maintain discipline. Whippings were routine. Branding was used to mark enslaved people as property, literally burning the owner's initials into human skin. Runaways were hunted with dogs. Every room at Harewood House is a conversion. Sugar into stone. Labour into luxury. Suffering into splendour. The house does not deny this. The interpretation panels that the Harewood House Trust has installed throughout the building state it plainly. But there is a difference between stating something and reckoning with it. And that difference is the gap between a panel on a wall and the weight of a life reduced to a line in a ledger. Resistance was constant, and eventually it was consequential. On the 14th of April 1816, the enslaved population of Barbados rose up in the largest rebellion in the island's history. It was known as Busa's Rebellion, named after an enslaved man called Busa, who is believed to have been one of its leaders, though the historical record is fragmentary. Several of the Lascelles plantations were directly involved. The Mount and Thicket estates, both owned by the family, saw significant participation from their enslaved workforces. The sugarcane fields were set on fire. Buildings were destroyed. One Lascelles plantation became a battlefield. The rebellion was crushed within 3 days by the British military, and the reprisals were savage. Many of those involved were executed or punished with extraordinary brutality. The rebellion involved hundreds of enslaved men and women across multiple plantations. It was not a spontaneous outburst. Evidence suggests it was planned in advance, with leaders coordinating across estates using the networks of communication that enslaved people had maintained despite their owners' best efforts to keep them isolated. The rebels destroyed property, burned cane fields, and fought British soldiers with whatever weapons they could find. The military response was overwhelming, and the aftermath was savage. Summary executions, public floggings, and transportations to other colonies. But the uprising sent a shockwave through the Caribbean planter class and contributed directly to the momentum for abolition. The enslaved people on the Lascelles plantations did not accept their condition passively. They fought, they burned, they risked everything, and their bravery acknowledged now by historians and by Harewood House itself, helped bring about the end of the system that had built the house they would never see. The Slavery Abolition Act was passed by Parliament in 1833, and the Emancipation Act that followed freed the enslaved populations of the British West Indies in 1838. But the terms of emancipation were designed to protect the interests of the enslavers, not the enslaved. The British government established a compensation fund of £20 million, an enormous sum to be paid to slave owners for the loss of their human property. The enslaved people received nothing, not a penny, not an acre of land, not a tool or a seed or a roof over their heads. They were freed into poverty, with no resources and no support, on islands where the only employment available was on the same plantations where they had been enslaved. Many continued to work for their former owners under an apprenticeship system that was, in practice, slavery under a different name. The government's legislation required formerly enslaved people to continue working for their former masters for a transitional period, receiving a nominal wage but subject to many of the same restrictions on movement, association, and self-determination that had characterized their enslavement. The system was designed to protect the planters' economic interests during the transition to free labor, and it achieved that purpose at the expense of the people it was supposed to liberate. On the Lascelles plantations, conditions during the apprenticeship period were reportedly appalling. In 1836, the second Earl of Harewood received an anonymous letter informing him that the managers on his Caribbean plantations were treating the apprentices with extreme brutality. Abolitionists seized on the reports. The apprenticeship system was abolished in 1838, and the Lascelles family received £26,309 in compensation for 1,227 enslaved people. That is £21 and 9 shillings per human being. The Lascelles were not the only recipients. Across the British Empire, over 46,000 claims were filed for compensation, covering more than 800,000 enslaved people. The total cost to the British government was £20 million, a sum so large that it required a government loan to fund. The money was paid by the British taxpayer. The loan that funded the compensation scheme was not fully repaid until 2015. Every person who paid income tax in the United Kingdom before 2015 contributed, however indirectly, to compensating the Lascelles family for the loss of their enslaved workforce. The people who were freed contributed nothing because they had nothing. They did not even have their own names. Many of them took the surname of their enslavers. The legacy of this dispossession has never been resolved. The formerly enslaved people of the Caribbean entered freedom with no land, no capital, no education, and no legal recourse against the people who had spent generations profiting from their bodies. The wealth disparity that slavery created between the white planter class and the black majority population has persisted in modified form for nearly 2 centuries. The plantations that the Lascelles owned are still visible in the Barbadian landscape, and many of the communities that surround them are still populated by the descendants of enslaved workers. There are people in Barbados today whose surname is Lascelles or Harewood, inherited from ancestors who were owned by the family that built the house in Yorkshire. Inside Harewood House, the 19th century brought changes that reflected the family's rising social status and declining connection to the Caribbean. Edwin Lascelles had died childless, and his title became extinct. The fortune passed to his cousin Edward, son of Henry's brother, Edward, who had served as the customs collector in Bridgetown. Edward was created Earl of Harewood in 1812. The family was now firmly embedded in the English aristocracy. Sir Charles Barry, the same architect who remodelled Highclere Castle and designed the Houses of Parliament, was commissioned in the 1840s by the 3rd Earl to expand the house, adding second stories to the flanking wings to create additional bedrooms for his 13 children. The Lascelles family was gradually selling its Caribbean plantations throughout the early 19th century, though the last plantation, the Bell Estate in Barbados, was not sold until 1975. Within living memory, the family that built Harewood House still owned the land on which enslaved people had worked. 1975, the year that Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, the year that the Vietnam War ended, the year that Jaws was released in cinemas. A branch of the family that built Harewood House still owned a sugar plantation in Barbados in the year that punk rock was born. The timeline is not ancient history, it is modern history. The gap between the Lascelles and the legacy of slavery is not measured in centuries, it is measured in decades. The most extraordinary chapter in Harewood's later history came in 1922, when Princess Mary, the only daughter of King George V, married Henry Lascelles, Viscount Lascelles, who would become the 6th Earl of Harewood. The wedding connected the Lascelles family directly to the British Crown, a family whose fortune was built on the trafficking and enslavement of African people was now part of the royal household. Princess Mary lived at Harewood from 1929 until her death in 1965, when she suffered a fatal heart attack while walking the grounds. The house was used as a convalescent hospital during both World Wars, echoing the pattern seen at Highclere and Chatsworth, where aristocratic homes were pressed into service by national crises that the families could not ignore. But at Harewood, the hospital transformation carried a particular irony. A house built by enslaved labour was now being used to heal the bodies of free men. The wedding was one of the great social events of the 1920s. Princess Mary was the people's princess of her era, beloved by the British public for her wartime service and her accessibility. Her marriage to a Lascelles connected the crown directly to the Caribbean sugar fortune in a way that no one at the time thought to question. The couple initially lived at nearby Goldsborough Hall before moving permanently to Harewood on the death of the 5th Earl in 1929. Princess Mary became a fixture of Yorkshire life, developing the Himalayan garden that visitors can still explore today and supporting local cultural institutions. She was the Princess Royal, a title reserved for the eldest daughter of the sovereign, and her presence at Harewood lent the estate a royal cachet that other country houses could only dream of. When she died in 1965, walking the grounds of Harewood, she collapsed on the same parkland that Capability Brown had designed from sugar money nearly 2 centuries earlier. The connection was not discussed at the time. The slavery that funded the landscape where a princess took her last breath was not part of the story that anyone wanted to tell. It would not be discussed for decades. The 7th Earl of Harewood, George Lascelles, was Princess Mary's elder son. He became one of the most significant figures in British cultural life in the 20th century, serving as director of the Royal Opera House and later of the English National Opera. He was a man of genuine artistic sensibility who collected 20th century paintings with the same discriminating eye that his ancestors had brought to commissioning Chippendale furniture. The Epstein Adam, the monumental alabaster nude that now stands in the entrance hall, was his acquisition. So were the Italian Renaissance paintings that are now among the most important in any English country house. He also married twice, and his divorce from his first wife in 1967 caused a scandal because it required the Queen's consent under the Royal Marriages Act. A reminder that the Lascelles family's connection to the Crown was not merely ceremonial, but legally binding. The 7th Earl opened Harewood to the public and began the process of transforming the estate from a private family home into a cultural institution. But the slavery question was not yet part of the conversation. That would take another generation. The reckoning came slowly, and it came from outside. In 2005, as part of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, the 8th Earl, David Lascelles, spoke publicly about his family's connection to slavery. That period in history is both fascinating and gruesome, he told the Yorkshire Post. The family opened the Lascelles archive to researchers at the University of York, who catalogued 7 boxes of documents covering the period from 1677 to the 19th century. The archive was conserved with funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund and made available to scholars. The 8th Earl's willingness to open the family's records was significant, because the documents contained material that was deeply unflattering. They revealed the floating slave factory. They revealed the scale of the lending and foreclosure operation. They revealed the specific prices at which individual human beings had been bought and sold. The Earl acknowledged that the material was difficult. Having seen a preview tape of the documentary that resulted, he noted that the inference is that they have unearthed some forgotten skeletons, something we were trying to cover up, which is not the case at all. There is no acknowledgement that we actually helped in making the program. The tension between the family's desire to be transparent and their discomfort with how that transparency was presented is itself part of the story. Honesty does not come with editorial control. In 2007, and the BBC arranged for the actor David Harewood to visit Harewood House and interview the Earl. The meeting was extraordinary, and not just because of its historical resonance. David Harewood is a black British actor whose ancestors were enslaved in Barbados by the Lascelles family. His surname, Harewood, is a Lascelles plantation name, passed down through generations of people who were never given the choice of their own identity. He carries the name of the house that his ancestors' labour built, a house that stands on land purchased with money, made from people who were his direct forebears. The meeting between the black actor, named Harewood, and the white Earl, who inherited Harewood, was broadcast on BBC Look North and is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of television ever produced about the legacy of slavery in Britain. Two men standing in a room filled with Chippendale furniture, one of them a descendant of the people who bought the furniture, and the other a descendant of the people whose labour paid for it, sharing a surname that neither of them chose, and that means entirely different things to each of them. In 2023, it was announced that a portrait of David Harewood had been commissioned and would be hung in Harewood House. A black man, named after his family's enslavers, would look down from the walls of the house those enslavers built. The portrait joins the Reynolds and Gainsborough portraits that line the gallery, the room where the Lascelles once held grand banquets beneath Biagio Rebecca's painted ceiling. It is a gesture. Whether it is enough is a question that Harewood House cannot answer for itself. Today, though, Harewood House is run as an educational charitable trust, and its approach to the slavery question has become a model for other English heritage institutions grappling with similar histories. The Trust has created on-site learning sessions and study materials that give teachers the tools to engage young people with the history of the transatlantic slave trade. It has commissioned a missing portrait series, collaborating with local schools to create artworks celebrating black role models whose stories have been excluded from the historical record. It has invited members of the local black communities in Leeds to share their experiences and perceptions of Harewood, creating a dialogue that extends beyond the interpretation panels and into the lived reality of people whose relationship to the house is shaped by histories of exclusion and exploitation. The house has hosted exhibitions by contemporary artists, including Anthony Gormley and Henry Moore, that engage with themes of body, labour, and power in ways that resonate with the estate's uncomfortable past. The house, gardens, and grounds are open to the public for most of the year. The Chippendale furniture remains in the rooms for which it was made. The Robert Adam interiors survive. The Capability Brown parkland stretches to the lake that J.M.W. Turner painted when he visited in 1797 as a young artist of 22, producing watercolours of the new house and its landscape that are among his earliest important works. Turner was commissioned by the family, and his paintings of Harewood capture the estate at the height of its Georgian splendour. The golden stone of Carr's facade glowing in the Yorkshire light, the parkland rolling down to the lake, the whole composition radiating the kind of serene prosperity that the Lascelles were desperate to project. Turner, of course, did not paint the plantations. He did not paint the enslaved people. He painted what he was paid to paint: beauty. The Egyptian gallery holds not pharaonic artifacts, but the works of the 7th Earl's collection of 20th century art, including Jacob Epstein's monumental alabaster sculpture, Adam, a nude male figure carved from a single block of stone that caused enormous controversy when it was first exhibited and did not arrive at Harewood until 1961. The irony of a sculpture called Adam standing in a house built by a family that treated human beings as property is not lost on the current custodians, nor is the irony of a house that was built to display wealth now serving as a vehicle for confronting the source of that wealth. Harewood's approach to its slavery history is among the most direct and comprehensive of any English country house. The interpretation is woven throughout the building, not confined to a single room or a side exhibition. Visitors are not allowed to forget, and yet the beauty persists. The Chippendale armchairs are still gilded, the Adam ceilings are still painted, the Reynolds portraits still look down from the gallery walls. The house is still, by any measure, one of the most magnificent in England. The question that Harewood forces on every visitor is whether magnificence and moral horror can coexist in the same building, whether beauty built on suffering is still beautiful, and whether knowing the cost changes what you see when you look at a gilded chair. The answer, of course, is that it does and it does not. The Chippendale armchairs are no less exquisitely made for knowing that sugar money paid for them. The Adam ceiling in the music room is no less accomplished for knowing that the Axminster carpet beneath it was woven from profits extracted from human misery. Beauty does not care about its origins. A carved curtain swag that tricks the eye into believing it is fabric is a masterpiece of woodworking, whether its commissioner was a saint or a slave trader. But the viewer is changed. Once you know that the money came from ships, live from the floating slave factory off the coast of Guinea, from the Caraco merchant with its 100 enslaved passengers, from 24 plantations where babies died before they could walk and adults died before they turned 23, you cannot look at the gilded armchair the same way again. You can still admire it. You can still recognize the genius of Chippendale, but the admiration is no longer innocent. It is informed, and informed admiration is a different thing from wonder. It is heavier. It carries the weight of 12 to 15 million African people who were torn from their homes to feed an economic system whose material legacy includes some of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. Harewood House is honest about this. It puts the panels on the walls. It opens the archives. It commissions the portraits. It invites the descendants of enslaved people to walk through the rooms and tell the cameras what it feels like to carry the name of your ancestors' enslavers as your own, whether honesty is enough, whether panels and portraits and educational programs can ever balance the ledger of a fortune built on human trafficking, is a question that Harewood House will be answering for as long as the Chippendale armchairs remain in the music room, and the sugar money remains in the walls, and the name Lascelles remains on the electoral rolls of Barbados, carried by people who never chose it and can never put it down. If this story challenged you, surprised you, or made you see a gilded chair differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which dynasty, landmark, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface. That may be the darkest story of all.